I was 10 years old the first time my mother called me the family disgrace. It wasn't said in anger. That would have been easier to understand, easier to forgive. No, she said it casually, like she was commenting on the weather or the price of vegetables. Her voice carried across the courtyard, light but sharp enough to cut through me. Look at them, she told a group of relatives, shaking her head in disappointment. No talent, no discipline, just a disappointment. The words didn't hit me all at once. At 10, you don't fully grasp how labels can become chains. But I understood the laughter that followed. I understood the way my cousins looked at me, half amused, half relieved that they weren't the target. And I understood that something had just changed. From that day on, I wasn't just their child anymore. I was the example, the one they used to scare others into obedience. Study harder. My father would tell my siblings, his voice firm, or you'll end up like them. I learned quickly that love in our house came with conditions. It had rules, expectations, and invisible lines you were never supposed to cross. My older brother always stayed within those lines, top of his class, confident, praised at every opportunity. My younger sister didn't even need to try. She was naturally charming, the kind of child who made people smile without effort. And me, I was always just outside the lines. Every report card felt like a courtroom where I was both the accused and already guilty. If I scored well, it was dismissed as luck. If I slipped even slightly, it became proof of everything they believed about me. You're not even trying, my mother would say, flipping through my papers without really looking at them. I would whisper, though my voice never seemed loud enough to matter. My father didn't bother with whispers. Trying isn't enough when you're this far behind. He'd say bluntly, face reality. Reality, it became a word I started to hate. Because their version of reality didn't include who I actually was, only who they had decided I would always be. I stopped arguing after a while, not because I agreed, but because it felt pointless. Words couldn't compete with a label that had already been accepted by everyone around me. Silence became my shield. At school, I was different. Not exceptional, not extraordinary. But not the failure they described either. Teachers saw effort where my parents saw weakness. Friends laughed with me, not at me. For a few hours each day, I felt almost normal. But home had a way of erasing that feeling. The walls of our house seemed to echo with disappointment. Even when no one spoke, I could feel it lingering in the air, heavy and suffocating. I started staying out longer, at the library, at school, anywhere that didn't remind me of what I was supposed to be. Still, no matter how late I returned, no one ever asked where I had been. It was as if my absence didn't matter. Or maybe they just assumed I wasn't worth worrying about. The breaking point came on a night that was supposed to be joyful. My cousin's engagement celebration. The house was filled with lights, laughter, and the smell of rich food. Guests moved in and out, voices blending into a constant hum of celebration. I stayed near the edge of the room, as I always did, hoping to pass the evening unnoticed. But unnoticed was never an option for me. Come here. My mother's voice cut through the noise. My stomach tightened. Slowly, I stepped forward, feeling dozens of eyes turned toward me. My mother smiled, placing a hand on my shoulder as if she were about to introduce me with pride. For a moment, just a moment, I let myself hope. Then she laughed. This one, she announced, her grip tightening slightly, is our family's biggest mistake. The room fell into an awkward silence before a few people chuckled uncertainly. She'll never amount to anything, my father added from across the room, not even bothering to look at me. Mark my words, something inside me didn't break, it stilled. I looked around, searching for someone, anyone, to disagree, to defend me, to say it wasn't true. No one did, and in that silence, I finally understood something that had been building for years. I didn't belong here. Not as their child, not as their disgrace, and not as anything they had decided I was. That night, while the celebration continued, I went back to my room and packed a small bag. I didn't cry. I didn't hesitate. Because for the first time in my life, I wasn't running away. I was choosing to leave. The first night after I left, I didn't feel brave. I felt cold, not just from the night air that slipped through the thin fabric of my clothes, but from the sudden, overwhelming realization that I was completely alone. No safety net, no familiar walls, no voices critical or otherwise waiting for me, just silence, and for the first time in my life, that silence didn't suffocate me. It scared me, but it also gave me space to breathe. I slept on a wooden bench at a bus station, my small bag clutched tightly to my chest. Every sound made me flinch: the rumble of engines, distant footsteps, the low murmur of strangers passing by. I barely slept, but when morning came, I stood up with something unfamiliar settling inside me. A decision. If I was going to survive, I couldn't afford to be the person they said I was. I had to become someone else. The early days were the hardest. I took whatever work I could find, cleaning tables at roadside cafes, washing dishes until my hands turned raw, carrying boxes in small shops that paid barely enough to cover a single meal. I learned quickly that the world didn't care about your past. It only cared about what you could do right now. And right now, I could work, so I did. Every rupee I earned, I split carefully. Food, a place to sleep when I could afford it, and the rest saved with a stubborn determination I didn't fully understand yet. Some nights I went to bed hungry, telling myself it was temporary, that everything was temporary, because it had to be. I found my refuge in places no one paid attention to. The back corner of libraries, quiet classrooms left unlocked, anywhere I could sit with a book and remind myself that my story wasn't finished. Education became my escape, not because I was naturally brilliant, but because I refused to stay the same. I studied late into the night, using borrowed books and scribbled notes. When I didn't understand something, I tried again, and again, and again. There was no one to tell me I couldn't do it anymore, only my own voice, and I was learning how to silence doubt. Years passed like that, slow, grinding, relentless, but something was changing. I started to notice it in small ways at first. A teacher who paused a little longer when reviewing my work, a supervisor who trusted me with more responsibility, a stranger who called me capable without hesitation, words I had never heard growing up. I didn't know how to react to them at first, but I held on to them. Eventually, those small moments turned into something bigger, a scholarship opportunity. It wasn't easy to get. Nothing in my life ever had been. But when I saw the acceptance letter in my hands, I stared at it for a long time, almost expecting it to disappear. It didn't. That was the first time I allowed myself to believe something dangerous. Maybe they were wrong. University life wasn't perfect. I was older than some of my classmates, quieter than most, and still carrying the weight of years spent proving I wasn't enough. But this time, the environment was different. No one knew me as the disgrace. They only knew me for what I did. So I worked harder than anyone else, not for recognition, not for approval, but because I had spent too many years being underestimated, and I wasn't going to underestimate myself. I changed my name during that time, not officially, but in the way I introduced myself, in the identity I built. It wasn't about hiding from my past. It was about refusing to let it define me. Piece by piece, I built a life that had no connection to the one I left behind. New friends, new mentors, new opportunities. Each step forward felt like reclaiming something that had been taken from me long ago. And still, I never contacted my family, not once. Sometimes late at night, the thought would cross my mind. I would wonder if they had noticed my absence, if they had searched for me, if they regretted anything they had said. But those thoughts never stayed long, because deep down I already knew the answer. They had made their judgment years ago, and I had made mine the night I left. By the time I graduated, I wasn't the same person who had slept on that bus station bench. I wasn't even close. I had become someone stronger, sharper, more certain, not because the world had been kind, but because it hadn't been. And as I stood there, holding the results of everything I had fought for, I realized something quietly, without anger or bitterness. They would never recognize me now, not because I had changed too much, but because they had never truly seen me in the first place. I didn't expect my past to find me again. Not after everything I had done to leave it behind. Years had passed, enough for memories to dull at the edges, enough for the ache to turn into something quieter, something manageable. I had built a life that was structured, respected, and, most importantly, mine. My days were filled with purpose, my decisions guided by logic instead of fear. And then, one file changed everything. It landed on my desk like any other, just another case among many. Property dispute, financial mismanagement, internal conflict within a family business. Nothing unusual at first glance. Until I saw the names, my hands didn't shake, not anymore, but something inside me shifted, like a door I had carefully sealed was suddenly pushed open. I read the file slowly, deliberately. Every detail confirmed what I already suspected. It was them. My family, the same people who had once called me their greatest mistake, were now entangled in a legal battle that threatened everything they had built. Accusations of fraud, broken agreements, years of quiet dishonesty now dragged into the light. For a long moment, I sat there in silence. I could have stepped away, requested reassignment, passed the case to someone else. No one would have questioned it. It would have been the easier choice, the safer one. But I didn't. Not because I wanted revenge, but because I wanted truth. And for the first time in my life, I had the authority to face them without being diminished, so I accepted the case. The day of the hearing arrived with a strange sense of calm. The courthouse buzzed with its usual rhythm, lawyers moving briskly through corridors, the low murmur of conversations, the sharp echo of footsteps against polished floors. It was a world I knew well, a world where structure replaced chaos. But beneath that calm, something deeper stirred. Not fear, not anger, something steadier. Closure. I entered through the private corridor as I always did, unseen by the public gathering in the courtroom. From behind the closed door, I could hear the faint hum of voices inside, and then I heard them. My mother's voice hadn't changed. "She's probably nowhere," she said, her tone dismissive, almost bored. People like that don't suddenly become successful. A pause. Then my father chuckled. Even if she walked in right now, what would she be? Nothing. Some clerk, maybe. That's all she was ever meant to be. The words hung in the air. Years ago, they would have shattered me. Now, they settled around me like dust, present, but powerless. I didn't react. I didn't step back. I simply stood there, listening, letting the final traces of their version of me dissolve completely. Because they weren't describing me anymore, they never had been. A knock sounded at the door. The bailiff's voice followed. "It's time," I nodded once and stepped inside. The courtroom fell into a quiet, expectant silence as I entered. Rows of people stood automatically, a gesture of respect ingrained in the system. At first, no one noticed anything unusual. Why would they, to them? I was just the judge assigned to the case, another figure in a robe, another authority behind a bench. But then recognition flickered, slow, uncertain, disbelieving. My mother's eyes locked onto mine first. I watched as confusion crept across her face, followed by something sharper realization struggling to take shape. My father frowned, leaning slightly forward as if trying to see more clearly. I took my seat, composed, steady, unshaken. The clerk began the formal introduction, their voice clear and precise as it echoed through the room. My name and then my title, a title earned through years of relentless effort, a title that carried weight, authority, and something my parents had never believed I could possess. Respect, the silence that followed wasn't ordinary. It was absolute. I didn't look away. I met their gaze directly, allowing them to see what they had refused to acknowledge for so long. Not a disgrace, not a mistake, but someone who had risen far beyond the limits they had set. My mother's lips parted slightly, but no words came out. My father's expression shifted from disbelief to something heavier, something closer to understanding. For the first time in my life, they didn't have anything to say good, because this moment wasn't about their words. It was about mine. I leaned forward slightly, my voice calm, controlled, and unmistakably firm. Proceed. The case began like any other. Arguments were presented, evidence examined, voices rose and fell in carefully structured exchanges. On the surface, it was just another legal proceeding, but beneath it everything had changed. Every statement they made, every defense they attempted, unfolded under my watch. Not as their child, not as their failure, but as the one person in the room they could no longer dismiss. And in that quiet, undeniable shift of power, something settled inside me completely, not anger, not satisfaction. Something far more lasting, truth. The courtroom didn't feel the same after that moment. On the surface, everything continued as it should: arguments, objections, evidence presented with careful precision. The legal process moved forward, steady and structured, as if nothing extraordinary had happened. But beneath that calm, there was a shift no one could ignore, especially them. My parents no longer spoke with the same confidence. The certainty that had once defined their voices was gone, replaced by hesitation, small pauses, uncertain glances, the subtle unraveling of control. They avoided looking directly at me now, as if contact itself carried too much weight. For years, they had defined me with a single word. Now they didn't know what to call me at all. I listened to every argument without interruption, my expression neutral, my thoughts clear. This wasn't personal, not in the way they might have expected. I wasn't here to punish them. I wasn't here to prove anything. I was here to do my job, and for the first time in my life, that was enough. The evidence against them was complicated, layered with years of poor decisions and quiet compromises. Not outright evil, but not innocent either. Contracts had been ignored, responsibilities shifted, trust broken in ways that left lasting damage. It wasn't a simple case, which made the outcome even more important. When the final day of the hearing arrived, the courtroom felt heavier than before. Every seat was filled, every voice lowered to a whisper. Even the air seemed to carry a kind of anticipation, as if everyone sensed that this decision meant more than just legal consequences. I reviewed everything one last time, not as their child, but as the judge, and then I delivered the verdict. The court finds that there has been clear negligence in the management of shared assets. I said, my voice steady and measured. Certain actions taken by the defendants have resulted in financial harm that cannot be overlooked. I paused briefly, allowing the weight of those words to settle. My parents sat completely still. The ruling, therefore, is partial liability. A murmur rippled through the room. They wouldn't lose everything, but they wouldn't walk away untouched either. Financial penalties, loss of certain holdings. Restrictions that would follow them for years. Consequences, fair, balanced, undeniable. I didn't look at them as I finished. Because this wasn't about watching them fall. It was about standing where they said I never could. Court is adjourned. The sound of the gavel echoed sharply, marking the end of the case, and something else far more personal. People began to leave slowly, voices rising again as the tension dissolved into conversation. Papers were gathered, chairs shifted, footsteps echoed across the floor. I remained seated for a moment longer, letting the quiet return. It was over, not just the case, everything. As I stood to leave, I noticed movement near the front of the courtroom. My mother. She hesitated before stepping forward, her usual confidence replaced by something fragile, uncertain, almost unfamiliar. My father followed a step behind, his posture stiff, his expression unreadable. For a brief moment, none of us spoke. Up close, they looked older than I remembered. Time had softened some edges, but not enough to erase what had been said, what had been done. We didn't know. My mother finally said, her voice low, almost careful. If we had. I raised a hand slightly. Not to silence her harshly, just enough to stop the sentence before it became something else. You didn't need to know, I said calmly. She blinked, caught off guard. You just needed to see. I continued, and you chose not to. The truth settled between us, simple and unarguable. My father exhaled slowly, as if searching for words that refused to come. For once, there was no criticism, no dismissal, just the quiet weight of realization. We were wrong, he said finally. It was a small sentence, but it came years too late. I nodded once, not in forgiveness, not in rejection, but in acknowledgement. I know there was nothing else to add. No apology could undo the past. No explanation could rewrite it. And strangely, I didn't need it to, because the person who had once stood in front of them, desperate to be understood, didn't exist anymore. I turned to leave. Wait, my mother said softly. I paused, but I didn't turn back. Can we fix this? She asked. For a moment, I considered the question, not emotionally, but honestly. Some things aren't meant to be fixed, I replied. Only understood. And with that, I walked away. Not quickly, not dramatically, just steadily, each step lighter than the last. I didn't look back because I didn't need to. They no longer defined me. They never really had. The title I carried now wasn't just something announced in a courtroom. It wasn't just a position or a symbol of success. It was something far more important. It was proof that I had taken every word they used against me and turned it into something they could never take away. Not their disgrace, not their mistake, but someone who had written their own ending and made it undeniable.